everyone, and welcome to The Trek. The Trek is a Civics Unplugged series where community members participate in meaningful discussions on topics that are too often neglected when thinking about building the future. Through prompting questions and provocations, we ventured together into complex but important conversations related to building the future and democracy. We understand that this work requires ongoing dialogue, but it's a journey worth trekking through. My name is Madison. I'm a high school senior from Birdgrass, Oklahoma, joined by some of our 2020 fellows, a 2021 fellow, and two special guests, which you will get to meet in just a moment. So tonight we're talking about storytelling, and we're starting off the conversation with a word association. So once you see your name up on the screen, do a brief little introduction and say your 1 to 3 words and why.
Hi guys. First of all, I've been getting a lot of people telling me that my voice has been shaking lately, as of today, because it's like freezing here. So if you hear shaking, it's not because I'm nervous, it's because like it's literally so cold and my parents refuse to turn on the heat. But hi, I'm Angel. I'm 18, a first year. I'm from Maryland, currently in Maryland. And when I think of storytelling, I want to think of, or I immediately come to ethical and humanizing. I think for the past year, I've been working for this organization called Our Climate Voices, which specializes in ethical storytelling in order to combat the climate crisis. So I think I've really learned that storytelling, in order to be truly effective and meaningful, needs to be ethical and needs to respect and there needs to be a respect of the power balances and the different positions, the positionality between the storyteller and the listener. So I really think of ethical now whenever I hear the word storytelling. And of course, humanizing, as I'm sure everyone else here agrees with. Stories are the gateway to appealing to each person's sense of humanity. So I think storytelling is a very important tool that allows us to, establish that pathos.
Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. My name's Julia. I'm 23 years old, living in Pennsylvania. My 2 words would be journey and strategic, probably. Journey just because like a good storyteller like makes you feel like you're experiencing that story and that journey real time. And strategic because like there's so many like little tactical details that go into creating a good story and feeling like you're really compelled to listen to the story. So yeah.
Hi everyone, I don't think Leora is here, so I'm just gonna go ahead. Hi, my name is Maryam, I'm 17, I'm a senior in high school, and my 2 words would be powerful because I feel like storytelling can really be used in a lot of different ways, and then timeless because I also love like the component of storytelling that's like historical. People have been using it like for probably beyond what I know and will continue using it, so I love that it's a timeless thing that we continue to talk about today because of how cool it is.
Because my computer isn't working for this thing I'm trying to do. Hey, love you. Come on.
All right.
Hey guys, my name is Jacob. I'm a junior at Jericho High School. And when I think of storytelling, I think of 3 words. I think of window, mirror, and culture. I guess those first 2 kind of go together. Since I feel like stories are a way for us to like share experiences so that other people can see what it's like. It's also a way for us to empathize with other people's stories because it's like there's different kinds of like trends that stories have, like a kind of like an archetype, where it's different stories from different places around the world will have like the same kind of trends. And then that last word, culture, because I feel like stories are like the basis of our society and the way that we interact. Like, for example, I think the Bible kind of like creates, is the basis for the Western culture. If you look at like, Native American tribes too, will have storytelling as a core part of passing on their culture. So those are the 3 words I think about when I think of storytelling.
All right. My 3 words are sexy Trojan horse. And the reason I say that is because when you're trying to communicate something and you just say the message straight out, it won't really go into people's brains. But if you start using characters and relatable stories and an arc and vulnerabilities and hardship and conflict and all the crap that they grow through, suddenly it becomes really sexy. And suddenly you're able to pierce into people's brains a lot easier. So I find storytelling so fascinating that way. And that's why, dude, stories have been around all of human culture to pass on all these messages. So stories are a sexy Trojan horse.
All right, so I've been thinking about this, and the word that kept coming up kind of almost seemingly nonsensically at first was healing. And I wasn't even really sure why that word kept coming up, but I felt like it's worth exploring. And I'm wondering if any of you all feel anything when you hear that. So far, my thoughts on it are that kind of along the lines of what a lot of you have already been saying, is as far as like this is a method of communication that is kind of wired into us since the beginning of humankind, and it can really reconnect people and kind of filter out all the clutter of our current situation. And that's what I think that might be coming from right now. So that's my word, just one.
I'm gonna put curiosity catcher. So I wasn't. I mean, I've never valued stories more than I do now. Which is why Ien's sexy Trojan horse really resonated with me. Because I'm just like, okay, there's a lot of things that we kind of need to do, and as a society, things we need to learn, things we need to think about. But the way that you get anyone's attention to be able to create any sort of mass coordination, mass enlightenment type thing is like, it's through stories. So that's a big open question for me. How do we use stories to level up our society?
Love that, Gary. I definitely resonate with everything everyone has said, but I also just want to add in flow state, because people who are able to tell really good stories obviously are able to get into the flow state. But on the other end, when you're listening to a good story, you kind of forget about everything else in the world. And it has this almost magic ability to have you be completely immersed in the storyline. I just think anything that has that capacity to make you forget about everything else and really get in the flow state is something that's so magical and powerful to be used for good or for bad. So yeah.
Awesome. Hey, Maddie, do you have a word association for storytelling?
I would have to say open-mindedness, because you have to be open-minded when you're like reading a book, because there's different types of points of view that when you're reading something or experiencing a movie, that when you get into it, you're open-minded between what's going on in the story as well as yourself, and you can just relate or find a new look onto things when you're in a story.
For sure. So thank you all for sharing those word associations. Now we can go into the actual conversation. So if anyone has a question or a provocation they want to post to the group, go ahead.
This could be a really quick one, but I just wanted to say that, Adam, your healing one really resonated with me. And like the first thing that my mind went to was a movie that I've watched recently called Soul on like Disney. And that movie, like, I cried so many times. It was so beautiful. And I think that like that aspect of storytelling is extremely healing. And like it kind of goes back to what I was talking about in terms of like the power that storytelling holds to like really make you feel something and like bring something so healing towards people. So I definitely resonated with that. I just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. Thank you. I kind of have a question myself, which is amongst all you here, just curious, like, what kind of stories do you guys gravitate towards in terms of format? I'm really curious, like, what really works for you in terms of, like, is it movies, or is it shorter things online, or is it books? Because I know that can vary a lot between people.
So yeah, adding off of your point about healing, Miriam and Adam, I think that definitely the degree to which a story like affects you and grips you, like depends on how much you really empathize and see the perspective of the character. So one movie that really killed me was Blade Runner 2049. It's kind of a story where, like, you know, a man in like a helpless world like thinks he has a chance to be something amazing. He takes that chance and finds out he's not amazing, but the fact that he took that chance made him realize that he was himself like meaningful. And I think I really understood his perspective and I understood his pain. And so that kind of movie, like I love that kind of movie since it really destroys me and I feel moved by the end.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that there are certain stories that cater to particular audiences, but an indicator of the most powerful story is ones that transcend people's preferences and what they really resonate with. So, like, I would have told you probably like 4 months ago that I was not interested in anything related to sci-fi. But recently, like, I watched Star Wars for the first time. I've been watching X-Men, and I'm realizing that like all these movies are actually living up to the hype. And I think that like that's a really good indicator. Either that means that like I haven't been exploring as much as I maybe should have been, or been as curious as I should have been. But I also think that's where like what Maddie said with open-mindedness, in terms of storytelling. I know that I've felt like I've kind of like limited myself in the past, to some of those like stories that really do transcend people's preferences or what they resonate with.
So I don't want to shift away from this question because it's so good, but I want to pose a provocation that we come back to later, which is the stories that we tell about ourselves so intensely shape the stories we're open to. And then, so back to the other question, Jacob, like when you said that, I was like, John Wick resonates with me on the deepest level. And no, not because I am a mass murderer. That's a separate issue. Because of the commitment, of the dedication to finishing the mission, the loyalty, the attitude, right? Like, it's like, and the love of the dog, right? I don't know. It's something that like no, I can't be overly logical with why I resonate so much with John Wick, right? But I'm sure other people have a similar kind of relationship with other characters. They're like, yeah, it kind of sounds dumb that I resonate so much and why I have a giant sticker of John Wick on my computer, but it is what it is. And I think it's important to analyze why people resonate with different characters.
Also, getting like more specific into format, I'm kind of the worst. Like, I'm the type, I will look up what happens in movies and shows before I watch them, because like I think I pick up on details more like when I'm watching. Like, I kind of enjoy that. And I notice that even in like bite-sized content, the same way, like I like content that kind of gives me like a teaser of what the end is going to be. I don't know, I feel like format wise, I just pick up on details that way.
I tend to like anything that is like either like a really long TV show, like that has a bunch of seasons, or like a series of movies or a series of books. I just get so sad when I'm really into a story and then it ends so suddenly, like in a movie. Like, I really just want to be in whatever world I'm in for as long as possible. And so those really short ones, they make me so unreasonably sad. So I usually stick to longer forms.
For me personally, I think format wise, this is so weird. I have such a very short attention span. So whenever I start a book, I get like 10 pages into it and then I'm like, okay, I'm bored. And then I don't come back to it for another maybe like 10 days. So now I have like 20,000 unfinished books that I still need to go finish. But for some reason, when it comes to podcasts, I am extremely attentive. And they seem to grasp my attention almost as if it's like a stranglehold, right? And I feel like for me, that probably relates back to, well, I'm Nigerian. And so a lot of our tradition is steeped in oral history. And so I have like a lot of memories of my parents, my like older aunts, my grandparents, telling me a bunch of stories of whether it be like Nigerian lore, like mythos, or just family history. So I think for me, because of that, like just being exposed to that at such a young age, just anything that's purely oral, so mostly podcasts, I'm very attentive to.
I think if we want to jump to like what Gary brought up, I don't know. I feel like Gary, you said this before. I'm not really sure. Someone I know said this. More like when if you say like you're a procrastinator and like you constantly say that or something like that, it's
Yep.
kind of like that's yeah. I think that was you. Like that's basically what you're being open to, and like in terms of experience, like you're consistently going to be a procrastinator if that's all you believe about yourself and like what you are telling about yourself to other people. So that's a good point to put under this.
I feel like there's another side of it too. I was hearing James Cameron talking about the Terminator and this scene when the Terminator is just like destroying this entire building and all these like bad guys or something, but there's something aspirational about that. There's like a part in ourselves where we want to be really badass and destroy things like John Wick or Terminator. So it's like we can resonate with people that are similar to where we are, but there's a reason that the superhero movies are like doing so well because they're so aspirational. It like speaks to our highest calling in self, you know, which is very powerful. Like that like brings together a lot of people.
For sure.
I also think to like both of your points, the things that we're like more in tune to, we kind of like recognize more. So I think there's like a lot of stories that are just like in the everyday, like I like people watching sometimes when like I'm on a train or like I'm just like sitting on a bench and like you can like see stories there too. But I'm pretty sure there's like a phenomenon where like if you learn a new word you keep hearing it, it's not because people are all of a sudden starting to like use it a lot more. It's just because like you're in tune to that. So I think that like your experiences and like what you're more comfortable with or like what you know like influences what stories you're able to perceive just like naturally and what you might necessarily like miss out on, not because you weren't paying enough attention but just because you weren't like your situation wasn't like attuned to certain people's stories. So I think that's why it's really important to like get different people's perspectives and like talk to new people and like all of that, because it really opens yourself up to a lot of different stories that you might have missed on your own just because of your own limited experiences.
Madison, do you want to talk about how, like, I remember something that really struck me that you said a few months ago was the way that you saw everyone changed once, like, you like saw more growth potential in yourself or something along those lines. Do you want to elaborate on that?
I'm trying to remember exactly what I said, but I know that, okay, so to tie it back to John Vervaeke, Jacob, for you that we were talking about earlier, a question that I asked John that I realized when I started like doing more stuff with CU, leaning into that sort of content, it was like, once I learned more about, how do I even say this? Like, once I just started to learn more about myself, I became so much more empathetic for other people, and I was able to see the good in so many more people. I'm not sure if that's exactly what I said or how that directly relates, but like it made me realize like, wow, like everyone has their role to play. Everyone has these like super unique, like Maryam touched on like their own experiences, and I love the way that you framed that, Maryam. Like you like frame almost like you frame your life in a certain way, like your worldview shapes that, and so it can be so limiting, like the boxes that we almost put ourselves in. And so I think that that's a great tie to like why we need to hear other perspectives as well. But I also want to post another provocation. If people want to keep talking on this one, go ahead, but so we don't forget it, I want to pose, you should live your life like you are the main character.
Just one last thing on that I was thinking about with this is that I think when I think about like my favorite movies that I'll go back to that make me comfortable that I'd like to watch, are movies that I on some level can relate to. Like they're about someone like me or something that feels familiar to me. But the movies that like really challenge me and make me like emotional, but I still want to watch something else entirely. So I think there's definitely room for two categories of like comfort movies or comfort stories versus the ones that challenge your thinking.
I love that. Maddie, go ahead. You don't have to raise your hand, by the way. You can just jump in.
Just personally, yeah. Personally, I find fictional stories really like attractive because it's a world where your mind allows you to like explore without any hesitation of stopping, and including like pulp fiction movies or fairy tale movies or anything at all. I find it so amazing, especially with art when it's connected with a fantasy world. I find it so alluring because it's like something that is so unique and everybody else's story is different from another. Like it can have the same topic, but totally different endings. And I find that really like amazing because everybody has like their will to make a story in a sense.
This is kind of just like a side point for that. I think like it's kind of interesting. I think we're all very open to like being forgiving to ourselves. Like we're hard on ourselves like more than anyone, but we're like when it comes to things that we go through, like we're most forgiving. But it seems like especially through the internet, like the masses aren't so forgiving on other people. Like crap, where was I gonna go with this? Wait, I'll think later. I'm forgetting right now. Never mind. Thank you though.
I want to add on to what Madison said at the end there about like the will to make a story. So there's this psychoanalytic theory called meaning management theory, which essentially says like people will make a meaning, they'll make a picture, they'll make a face out of things that aren't stories or pictures or faces, because they want to see some kind of coherence between what's happening now or what they're seeing in front of them. So they'll make stuff up. But like I think of like there's like a Shakespeare quote, I think, which is like all the world's a stage and we're merely players. Like we all like have these little roles that we identify with. Like, you know, like my job is this, my position is this, I am this to other people. So that's definitely, I'm thinking of that with like Gary's point about the stories we tell ourselves. Like we define our role in life, and then we can also identify with other people who are similar to us. So that might be why certain stories resonate with people more than others. And then like Madison's point about you should live your life like the main character. I don't know, I agree with that. And then I actually want to go back one more time. I really liked Ian's point about like stories being like a sexy Trojan horse, because like we'll see like a meaning and it'll be buried in the story, but he couldn't say it flat out and it wouldn't have the same resonance if he did say it flat out. So I remember like Jordan Peterson's a really big fan of Dostoevsky, because I'm like, you know, he embeds like all these really good existentialist philosophical values, but like it takes place in the arc of a story. So I think storytelling is like a really good way for us to explore and also like understand new perspectives.
If I can for a sec, I'd like to tie a couple things together I've been hearing, because I heard, I think Madison mentioned empathy earlier, which had me curious to hear more about. Ien, you said that you spent a long time trying to make empathy sexy, in your words. And I think it connects well here, because we're talking about living your life like you're the main character in a story. And I totally agree with that. And I'd like to add that in terms of connecting that to empathy, one of the biggest leaps in my own personal life and developing my own empathy was realizing that every single person that I see on the street is another main character in their own story, and that their story is just as intense and powerful and deep and layered as mine. So yeah, I just wanted to add that in. And also I wonder if Ien wants to talk a bit about his experience in using storytelling to help spur empathy or make it sexy.
Yeah, you know, in a lot of the content we were making, we were bringing all types of people together in the same space, including flat earthers, incels, feminists, all types of politicians, like just everybody. And one thing that I kept learning over and over is that the deeper you dive into someone's life and get information, you start to understand exactly why they think the way they do and what they do. So there's a quote somewhere it's like, I don't know if it's in the Bible or something like that, but it's something like, God loves all because he knows all, which is to say that there's no one you can't love if you fully understand their experience of life. And I do believe that's true. It's like you're judging people on the surface because you have limited information. But if you go a little deeper, then there's no way that you can't empathize. And that's the beauty of story. It allows you to kind of do that. And I think what I was picking up from what Julia was saying was I was thinking about this idea of like cancel culture, or like writing off people.
That's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, writing off people based on, you know, maybe one mistake that they made that might be a terrible mistake, but I mean, you know, everyone being a main character of their own lives. Imagine if you were the main character and you were for the rest of your life kind of shunned for a mistake, right? It's harsh. And some people do deserve that here and there, I guess, to learn the lessons that need to be learned. But, you know, better to give benefit of doubt than come from a place of judgment, is my opinion.
Amen.
I agree completely with that. Every time I've seen somebody be a part of cancel culture or canceling a person, I feel so bad for the person who's getting pushed like that, because it's just like, imagine if you were in that setting and you did one bad thing and it ruins your reputation for anything else. Imagine if you're trying to get a job and they heard that you did this one bad thing, and now you have like, you basically blacklist that person that you're canceling. Like, yeah, they did a bad thing, and yeah, you should be upset with them, but you shouldn't force them to not be able to open other doors, per se.
I think that goes back to Adam's point of like, when people do cancel each other, it's kind of like dehumanizing that person. Like that's literally a human, and like everyone makes mistakes. I mean, some mistakes are obviously way bigger than others, but yeah, I kind of like sometimes putting yourself as the main character and like almost above all can be toxic in that way. Because again, like I said, kind of dehumanizing other people in certain ways, but yeah.
I completely agree. And also, in a way to like take it back to the prompt, a way that I like to think about it is like, everyone should think about themselves as if they're the main character. And like Adam was saying, like, don't treat other people like they're side characters. Because when this like whole thing kind of like blew up on TikTok with the idea of like, oh, treat yourself like you're the main character, and like, you know, don't treat yourself like you're like a side character in someone else's story, like, you know, really like put yourself in the spotlight. Like, it was like really positive, but then other people were like, started to turn it into something where it was like, oh, well, you're a side character and you're a main character and you're like the best friend, and like all this stuff where it's like not the right dynamic that we should bringing things into this. So I think that like the word, like one of my favorite words is like sonder, which is like the realization that like other people are living just as like complex lives as you are. And it like every time that I like think about that and have that realization, it's just like a new wave of empathy all over again, because it is so like crazy to think that someone is living a life just as complex and crazy as yours is. So like definitely embody main character ideology, but also like recognize that every single person is like the main character, but like you're just not in their story. So yeah, I think that ties into maybe why people feel like okay to do like cancel culture, because like it's just somebody else, like another player on the scene of like their life story, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think that there just becomes like a problem with like empathy when people don't have that realization. But yeah.
Yeah, and adding on to that, I think like just because, and I agree that like you should treat yourself like the main character, but that doesn't mean that you should treat everyone else like crap. That's not it's not what that means at all. And I think like onto that idea of Sonder is that I think it's what makes humanity so cool is that everyone has their own unique stories and it's so amazing. I think we have to treasure that instead of doing bad things with it, like Maryam was getting to.
Yeah, I think it was the Stoics that had this practice called like the view from above, where they'd practice like dissociating from themselves and seeing things from a third person perspective. So I think like by default, because we have a mind and like we think, like we see ourselves as the first priority, and we see everything from our perspective. Like this is not a thing about, like you being the main character, other people not being the main character. It's all in your head, So I think there's like a certain skill to like be able to dissociate and then tell the more honest story. I understand other people's perspectives. So I think a little like a provocation, maybe like a question is like, how can we get better at telling a more complete story? Because I feel like if we have a story that's too short or too short-sighted, we can make a mistake in like reducing people to something too small, like stereotyping, or we can just like, make assumptions and go too far, then that could ruin somebody's reputation. So I guess, yeah, how can we get better at telling a more complete story?
I think that this goes back to the idea that like it's good to see your life like I don't know. I definitely appreciate the whole idea of living your life like the main character, but there's also a problem with seeing our lives in a storyline because there's so much that doesn't match up, right? Because in a story, it follows this very uniform pattern and every little detail matters. But in life, that's not how things go. Like in reality, there's like so many storylines going on at a time. And so it can be really like, I don't know, I guess in a way it could be harmful to think that like, and I guess also in a way it could be very like uplifting to think that the best next thing is around the corner. And maybe that's why even though it's not accurate or it's deceiving in a way, we like to think in stories because it's, as Adam points out, it's healing. So I don't know, this might be just like a tangent from the question, but maybe it's not completely like accurate, but I don't know.
Yeah, I totally get that. And it's funny that you mentioned that. It kind of makes me think about how in the past I really gravitated towards dramas, through my mid-20s to mid-30s. I was really interested in dramatic stories and dramatic acting, and more in the last couple of years, especially since this pandemic has started, I almost completely watch comedy exclusively, comedy and game shows, and it's like a self-aware practice of just using stories and entertainment and media as kind of like a pacifying force or a healing type of thing. And I appreciate more than ever that there's kind of a huge broad rainbow of all that out there, that there's intense, heavy drama, that there's kind of formulaic hero's journey stories with a beginning, middle, and end, and they always have a happy ending. And then there's also just really kind of like wild, absurdist stuff that doesn't follow any kind of train of thought. I think there's a valuable place for all of it in there.
When it comes to entertainment, I kind of enjoy incomplete stories because I think it leaves like a lot for interpretation. Like you have the details and you can kind of come up with what you want. Because at the end of the day, even like if I say a blatant statement, people's different outlooks and perspectives can take that in a different way. So I kind of like open-endedness of incomplete stories. Yeah.
Yeah, just to kind of bring it back to like the empathy point from before too, one of my favorite filmmakers is Hayao Miyazaki, the animation guru. And The reason I love him so much is because there's no clear like absolute bad guys in any of his films. There are like demons and things like that, but then it shows you like why this demon is that way, because they've been so hurt and traumatized in the past, and then they turn to hurting others because they're hurt in the inside. So I feel like a complete helpful story is one where, you know, it's not bad guys versus good guys or good guys versus bad guys. It's everyone's a good guy in different shades. That makes sense.
I forget who I was telling this to earlier today. I think it might have been Madison and Gary, but I was saying how I didn't watch Disney growing up because my mom didn't want me to, because she said life was too perfect in all the Disney shows. And she didn't think that I should be watching something where life was portrayed in such a everything works out type of way. But I think to Adam's point, I can appreciate, and I just never, I'm just so, I don't know any references to any Disney shows because of that. But to Adam's point, there is such a broad range of stories, and I appreciate that. And there's something for everyone. So those feel good things are vital just as much as the ones like Miyazaki movies, which are more complicated and show all the holes. So both ends of the spectrum are important. I've grown to appreciate that as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what you were just saying and what Ien was saying, and kind of reconnect with the question at the top of the header here, because I realized I kind of got off topic, but I wanted to add that as far as like a useful tool for telling a more complete story, I think is really paying attention to that vulnerability of your characters, because that will always connect whether or not their situation is the same, because we all know how it feels to be wrong and ashamed and, oh, we messed up and everyone is, you know, pointing at us or whatever, and we all know what it's like to have some personal victory at some point. We all want to feel that. So the more we highlight those inner experiences in our characters somehow, we're going to connect better.
Yeah, and I almost wonder if the reason why we tell incomplete stories is because, in a way, empathy kind of ruins stories, right? Like, if you think that the bad guy has reason for doing what he's doing, then what's your reason to root for the good guy, right? So I feel like, I don't know, in life, it's important to have empathy, and maybe we should kind of like what I was touching on earlier in terms of like looking at our life as a story. That's kind of like where things get like lost in translation, and it becomes difficult when you lose empathy. But like in stories, I don't know, empathy, like ever since I know like our conversation with Ien, the Unplugged conversation, we talked a lot about empathy. Like that has changed how I watch movies, and I'm like, who is the real bad guy in the situation? So.
And I think a lot of the times the reasons why incomplete stories exist are because the makers of those stories are attempting to make those stories palatable to a certain audience. And so they appeal to those audiences' biases. So back to what Jacob was saying a little bit earlier, when he posed this provocation, when you have stories that are meant to, I guess, to cater to specific tastes, you leave yourself more vulnerable to playing into stereotypes, etc., which creates a very black and white picture that ignores a lot of, I don't know, like the gray of human existence that Adam was talking about. You pay attention to the two extremes rather than focusing on the entire spectrum in between. So I think if we want to tell a more complete story, we have to be honest with who our audience is and why we want to tell that story. I think we need to be more forthright with our goals as well. And try to tell the more difficult or go the more difficult route, and sometimes the more unmarketable route, and, you know, display the humanity between any character that you're trying to display in a narrative.
So this is, so Angel's point reminded me that the channels through which we distribute media or are able to really shape what media is actually pumped through it. So YouTube really decentralized the ability to tell stories to mass audiences. Ien knows this better than like anyone. And like when there was 3 channels, like in the 50s and stuff, you had to be green lighted by like a particular type of people in a boardroom. So yeah, I mean, I think, it's tricky now because the same platforms that have democratized so much are also censoring a lot of stories as well. So I don't really have a, I don't know, it's complicated, but I think the overall arc of the past like decade or so has been a serious democratization of stories. What's up, Maddie? Go ahead.
I personally think, like what Madison said, or yeah, I think actually the opposite. I think having more feeling towards the antagonist entices you to be more with the story or what's happening, because when you feel for an enemy or you feel for what they're doing and you know exactly why and you understand it, you'd rather help them than hurt them. And it makes you more interested in what's going to happen next. And I personally think that to fulfill an ending is to complete what the goal was from the beginning. If it were to kill the protagonist or kill the enemy, instead of that, see how the story was played out. If they were meant to kill somebody, then have the character go through a bunch of trials to see if they were wrong or right. They have to learn a lesson before the story can end.
I could add something to that. I think I see Maddie and Madison where you're both coming from. I think that one thing we learn in like storytelling classes and stuff is that if you can really relate to why the so-called villain in the story is doing what they're doing, then the villain becomes a lot more powerful and scarier. And I can see that mirrored in our own culture where we kind of dehumanize people and want to villainize them. When we do that, we're often like kind of making their argument absurd. We are kind of taking away their power by making their mission silly or just kind of cartoonishly evil. And there's something in terms of like using that story device as a tool in our own culture. I think it shows us that like when we pay attention to the human element of, you know, the antagonist in our own story, we're also like, we're humanizing them and we're coming closer to empathizing and understanding them.
To add on to Angel's point from a few comments ago, I think that there's no way we can tell a complete story. Like you can't have one piece of media that tells the entire like story of human existence. And there's nothing wrong with telling specific stories. It's about who's getting to tell those specific stories and broadening the access to have everyone be able to tell those stories that they want to tell. And to what Gary was saying, like how people are able to do that on YouTube, but that comes with its own level of censorship and everything like that. So, yeah.
I'm thinking of the point that Angela made earlier about like, we need to be honest about our audience when we're telling stories. Like, going back into Ian's point at the beginning about stories being sexy Trojan horses, like a story will have like a meaning or a message, or like it's supposed to tell you something that you can learn from the way that the story unfolds. Kind of also going back to what Gary was saying, like the media form and the audience like influences what actually happens in the story and what gets told. I think like a certain complexity can get erased when there's like a certain objective that the story is trying to fulfill. Like you think of like propaganda stories, like the story is designed to motivate or demotivate certain groups of people based off of what happens. I just wanted to bring that part up there.
Okay, anything to add to this provocation before we move on to reflection?
Specifically, like responding to Jacob as well, like a really recent example of this. Even though it also just, I think, two things. A really recent example of this, even though you might not consider this a story, but I guess it all like boils down to what you consider to be, you know, a story. I think that's a really important clarification to get down, but I digress. The 1776 report, I don't know if you guys had a chance to read that or saw anything on Twitter about that, but when you have a specific objective in attempting to relay a story to an audience, you can see that a lot of things get flattened. I reading the 1776 report, they like majorly downplayed slavery, or just thinking about American textbooks from even as recent as about a decade ago, how they completely downplay the various atrocities on different groups in order to upplay the superiority of other groups. The objective that the storyteller or the person who's relaying the story has in mind when doing so is such an essential question, especially for us who are digesters of media in general. Because I feel like if we don't have that question in mind, stories are powerful tools, as we've all established here. And the sexy Trojan horse can go both ways. So I think it's really important that we continuously ask ourselves, why is the story being told to me like this? What is the objective of the story? Because if not, we could be swayed into believing some pretty questionable things.
Something to that. I completely agree to that. And speaking of like villaining and people in the news, I've noticed, like to, when they want you to empathize with a person and make them seem like not the bad guy, they would constantly, oh, they were a parent of 5, they were this and this. And when they want to villainize a person, they'll say nothing and say, oh, they cruel, like they did some bad stuff, they like shot down gardens or whatever they can to push the fact that they're dehumanizing people, anybody really, depending on who they are. It could be anybody. If they don't like the image of that person, they'll purposefully make them seem worse than what they actually are, because they'll dehumanize the person that is truly actually the victim.
Yeah, great call out. If no one else has any other points to add to this, we can go on to reflection. I'm going to send a link to the notes we've been taking here so that you all can look over them for a minute, and I can get us started with reflection. I think it's cool how we gravitated towards storytelling as it relates to our own lives, and it's making me realize, like, I guess just how much of it doesn't translate over. I'm not surprised that since Ien's here, we ended up talking a lot about empathy, but just like in relation to, like, we see ourselves as the good guys, but if you think about, like, everyone sees themselves as the good guy, and, you know, Julia talked about cancel culture, like, we know that we do things that are bad, and that we would look down upon other people for doing, but it's just like we're constantly excusing ourselves because we feel like it's a part of our storyline. And so I guess just like this has helped me realize just everything as it relates to that.
This is kind of related, but also bringing in one other kind of point I'm thinking about. If you guys know Dan Harmon, the creator of Rick and Morty, there's a couple posts he has about story and story structure. And he always talks about story is when a character starts from a place that they know, this world that they're familiar with, and then something happens, they have to go get something, accomplish something, achieve something, and they dip into unconscious territory, things that they haven't faced before. And then when they get to the other side of it, there's a new consciousness of something they've learned or gained. So there's an expansion of consciousness, something like new that's come to the forefront, which is just amazing to think about, because all stories are about the evolution of human consciousness. It's like expanding forward. And if there's a story where something all just goes to crap and everyone dies or something, we just feel bad. Like it's not our nature for things to continually go bad. It's actually in our nature for things to improve always, which is what stories reinforce. Yeah, I just wanted to share that kind of insight that I thought gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's probably why people still gravitate towards really sad, dramatic movies, because even in those, you still see the main character like gain something from it. So I totally agree with that.
Personally, I think it makes the characters human. It shows them emotions. It shows them how to feel. Like, if you see them evolve from what they were to something else, they're evolving as a human being. They're getting better. If you start off with a bad character, I don't think a good story comes from a perfect character. Your main protagonist has to have flaws and has to overcome them over time. And once they do that, the story has ended and it's satisfying.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say in the us being the main character of our own stories, because if you think about a story with no conflict, it's incredibly boring. So if you're able to view your life from a bigger picture, from a bird's eye view, and look at it as a story, whenever you have conflict, those are actually the most interesting moments in the story. And so I reflect on that whenever I'm going through some stress or crap. I'm like, this is a great chapter in the movie. Like, this is a good episode, you know?
One way that like someone told me once before was like they put it as like character building, where like every like bad thing that happens, they're like, oh, this is just character development, it's character building, like this is just your character arc. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't know about that, but certainly puts it in a different perspective. So I love the way you phrase that as like just a good episode, because it's like a juicy one with a lot of things going on. So that was a great perspective.
Yeah, and just to like add on really quick, I know in reflections, but this is just such a good thread that I need to add on to. Like my favorite TV show of all time is BoJack Horseman, and that so much delves into all of that, all of the nitty gritty, all of that, all of the sad, everything. And I can't spoil the last season because that would be like the worst thing ever for me to do. But it so goes towards that. There's an expansion of consciousness at the end of the story. Anyways.
If I can add something, that also reminds me of the working. Oh, I already forgot the Rick and Morty. There you go. At the beginning, near the beginning, Rick used to always say like, haha, I'm just a bad dad and I'm a bad person. But later on, in like near the final end, he finally realizes what those words mean. And I'm like, wow, he used the same words twice in totally different moods. And it changed the story completely. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty neat. So like, depending on how far you're into becoming a different person, changes who you are now. Like you can say something now, but later on you can realize, wow, I'm actually this. And like you can feel yourself changing and hear it.
And adding on to that, like I've never really considered like how the way that we see a story changes as we experience it. Like how pervasive stories are and like shaping the way we approach things, to understand things. Because like a story about one thing can shape the story you make about another thing. So I guess this discussion demonstrated like how stories change you, and like that changes the way you see stories.
Yeah, my reflection is kind of along the same lines of just how like stories are so powerful and like do shape the way that we like come into like a lot of knowledge. And I think like one of the points that like Madison brought up earlier about like the news reminded me also of like textbooks, which are like supposedly fact, but like I think a lot about like my history book, and like I was watching a show that was like historical drama, and so like that skewed me towards like a character in history, and when I read it in my textbook it was completely opposed to her, and like we were having this discussion in class and I was like, oh, that's so interesting, the way that like people learned about her completely changed, and because I had a different story to combat like another story that I was receiving, it just changed the way that I was able to see like what should have just been a fact, if that makes sense. So like I think it's so interesting how stories can really shape things, and just like reflecting and bringing it all together, just how pervasive isn't really the word I'm looking for, but just how like stories are everywhere, and just kind of like thinking about the influence that they have, and also reflecting on like my own biases in like interpreting other people's stories too, because that definitely plays a role.
My reflection kind of goes to the point of the main character conversation. I was thinking a lot about exactly how empowering it is to be able to tell your own story, to be able to tell yourself your own story, to realize that to yourself, and if you want to share it with others, that too, but really how empowering it is to yourself to be able to tell your own story.
Before we move on, can I ask you, Leora, do you have any thoughts on why that is? Like, do you feel any specific experience in telling your own story? Do you have any reflections on why that makes you feel better?
Yeah, I think it has to do with human nature of being able to, do things on your own terms and be, as I think a lot of people want to be in control of their own lives, and that's very hard. So when you have that grasp on who you are and this is who I am and I'm comfortable with that, this is my story, I think that is so essential in feeling empowered, basically.
I think this was someone else about to speak. I'm not sure. Okay.
You can go ahead.
Thanks, Maddie. In response to Leora, I also think that, when you're living through your own story, kind of back to what Ien said about how going through challenges without framing your life in such an optimistic and amazingly interesting way can be very, very dreary and angst-ridden. And so when you're living through life, it's very easy to get bogged down in the various turmoils and tribulations that you're faced with constantly. So when you kind of frame your own narrative as a story, hindsight is 2020. So I think you gain a greater appreciation for where you've been and where you are. Like for instance, in class for like this warm-up activity thing that we did, our professor broke us out into breakout rooms and not forced us, but made us, I guess, give an account of our lives from the beginning of quarantine to the end. And while you're living through it, you don't realize that you're not the same person as you were yesterday, and you're not really cognizant of the immense amount of growth that you've experienced. But when you finally are able to gather up the various things that have happened to you into one cohesive line, I don't know, it's very astounding as to how much you've changed. And I think it's in that, right, very empowering.
That like goes exactly of what I was gonna say, or goes with it. I was gonna say, like, when you're telling your story or something about yourself, when you remember something and saying your story, sometimes biases change it. And when you're trying to downplay or upplay your story, sometimes between what you think happened or what actually happened are between in your head or what you remember. And I always remember hearing a story between my friends and I remember a long time ago. This is around a long time ago. This is when I was a little kid. And I remember this situation of when me and my friends made a group and we just talked about bananas. And so I remember my friend, her name's Lily, and she's like, "Oh, wait, didn't we talk about like, I don't know, avocados?" And another is like, "Oh, didn't we talk about peaches?" And between what we like, I personally like bananas, she likes peaches, and so on and so forth. We remember it differently between our own biases and what we remember the story being. I remember when I was younger, I thought I was super shy, but apparently I was really confident and really outgoing as a child, and I just never knew. Or so on and so forth. It's between our biases and what we personally remember something that changes the story and changes what happened.
Julia, Adam, or Gary, do you have your reflection ready?
I do.
Yeah. Oh wait,
Oh.
Adam, you go, Adam.
Okay. The one thing that really stood out to me in this talk, which there have been so many great things, was the idea of being conscious of accountability to who we're talking to and what we're trying to communicate. This is really big for me, and it's actually one of the main reasons I'm here today. My own personal situation is that I don't have like kids or younger siblings of my, in my family that I'm in constant contact with. So I really want to get more connected to people younger than me to find out what's resonating with them, and just what y'all are thinking about storytelling, because I have a bunch of ideas of my own, but I really feel like it's important to bounce them around and kind of help refine them. So I just want to put it out there that if that I'm available for like a conversation, if any of y'all want to talk about storytelling or share more thoughts or ideas about this kind of stuff, or even ask questions or whatever. But it makes me really excited to hear that you guys are on that same track too, of like who's hearing this and what do we really want to say. Excuse me.
No, that's awesome. And yeah, we're glad you're here today. So thanks for being here. But I think my point is that I just like always feel like reminding myself at that point, everyone's kind of, a few people have made this reflection, but also in the beginning of just like how much power your words have, not only on you and the story you tell for yourself, but like the stories you tell other people. Like movie lines, we know they can be so empowering on us in terms of like the emotions that we feel. And it's the same thing for our own words, even though we don't always put so much weight on that. Like even me talking about if I burnt my toast this morning, and if I can put it in a way of like, oh, I'm an idiot, or I can put it in like a humorous, lighthearted way of like things happen. And like even those slight moments during your day and how like you tell your story to other people impacts you internally. So yeah, I think just that part of the conversation is always a good reminder.
Yeah, that is so true. It's a big part of like a mental health and mental like self-care is to be conscious of what story about yourself you're telling yourself.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
I guess what this trek reminded me, well, so one thing that I like to say is that different systems, processes, cultures have certain values embedded in them, and also they engender certain values. But also I realized through this conversation that certain systems, processes, cultures, also they they can be fertile ground for certain stories as well, right? So treks, like now we can easily say that we had the story of learning about stories together and expanding our consciousness about stories, right? So it's a very simple format that we are all like weaved into right now. And like, yeah, stories are sort of subjective, but like there are certain situations that make it such that everyone's sort of experiencing the same sort of story. So I think it's just something for us to really think about, like when we're as we increasingly have the power to shape the society around us, like are you creating environments where people can have positive stories about themselves, about other people, so that it's not just like, hey, you're imposing a story on someone. It's like, yeah, obviously this story is happening. It's a great story. I'm happy to be part of it.
All right. I'd also like to know, Adam, Ian, and Jacob, since this was your first trek, what did you think about the format and just the trek in general?
I really like how, oh, sorry.
No, you go, Adam, you go.
Okay, I was just going to say, I really like how it starts with word association. I think that's a great way to spur conversation, and it encourages like spontaneous thought and new self-reflections on what you think about a topic, because that's what happened to me. I never would have consciously decided storytelling is about healing, but when I was asked to do a word association, it just came up. So I think that's a super effective idea.
Kind of like exactly on the same wavelength as Adam there. Like I really like the structure of the conversation, how we kind of open up like, what do we think about this word? What do we associate with it? And we kind of like, the discussion unfolds by itself. That's really cool. I particularly like how, in the end, like we reflect on the entire process and how we got to where we got and what messages we were taking home with us, because that kind of reflection is what, is how we separate what we take with us and what we absorb into the way that we see things. So I really like that.
Yeah, I was just gonna add on to that. I like the word associate in the beginning, just an opportunity to start with some fun, and then I just like how grounded it is. Just to be able to have a conversation and just kind of stream together. I really enjoy that. It keeps it honest, and then I mean, I love hearing people's personal kind of stories. Like the deeper those go, the more fun it tends to be. I think of like people's most favorite movies, Blade Runner, Rick and Morty, BoJack Horseman. The more of that kind of stuff, the more, I don't know, I feel like it gets to more of the heart of it's more personal and kind of relatable, I guess. It's fun. John Wick.
Yeah, that I actually want to add too, from a format perspective. I really love the split screen with seeing the notes. It helps me a lot, just like remember what topic we're on, and also it's really interesting to speak and like have my own idea of what I'm saying in my head, and then see that reflected back in the way someone else interpreted it. Is very interesting, and you guys do a good job, and it makes me more aware of like how I'm sounding to other people. So that's cool.
For sure. I think it's so obvious to me how ubiquitous stories are and just how kind of like embedded they are in our being, that we don't even realize a lot of the times when we're like in a story or following a storyline. I mean, like you all said with the structure, it's almost like every trek is a story, right? You start off with the word association, the conversation, then the end. So I guess if you think about it like that, the end. Thank you all for participating in this story. Was that cheesy, Julia? Anyways, seriously, thank you all so much for coming. I really enjoyed having both Ian and Adam, and of course, all of our community members. And if any of you want to come to a future trek, you are more than welcome. We have them all the time, and we would love to have you back.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you,
have a
guys.
great night, everyone. Bye.
Thank you guys. See you around soon.
Bye.